Hello and welcome to another episode of Immigration and Mobility Decoded, a podcast about business immigration and global mobility. We are recording this intro on April 24th. Final week of April is upon us. And Finn, how are things going for you?
Things are good. More rainy spring weather here in Maine, but everything's going pretty great. We got some exciting stuff to talk about today, and a
We
great
do.
guest. So looking forward to
Yes.
that.
Yes, we do have a great guest. In just a few minutes, everyone will hear our conversation with Mandy Feuerbacher, an immigration attorney who is a former counselor officer. She was stationed in a couple of countries, notably Hong Kong and I think elsewhere in mainland China. And great conversation. We hit on a lot, focus on the visa interview process. And, fun fact about Mandy, she says she's interviewed over 100,000. She interviewed over 100,000 people during her time as a consular officer. So she has a lot of great insights on that process and much, much more. And we can't wait for everyone to hear it. So that'll be coming up soon in a moment. Um, and Finn, before we catch up on some recent news for a few moments, I just want to take a quick moment to remind our audience that if you're watching on YouTube, we would appreciate a subscribe to our channel, helps the channel grow. And if you are either listening or watching on your favorite podcast app, such as Spotify or Apple, definitely would appreciate a follow so you can don't forget to turn on those notifications so you can be alerted to when new episodes are released. And we release new episodes every week, so yeah, can't wait for future content. So with that, Finn, you have saw an update about a new SHRM report or study.
Yeah, SHRM. So the Society of Human Resources Management, Society for Human Resources Management, excuse me, more commonly known as SHRM, one of the largest associations for HR professionals in the world, did a survey a few weeks back of employers based in the U.S., asking them questions about how immigration is impacting their workplace. There were a few notable findings from the report, very much in line with the findings from Envoy's Immigration Trend Survey from back in February. Um, one of which was a majority of employers surveyed agreed that increased immigration encourages economic growth and makes
Mm,
America more globally competitive, and would help lessen labor shortages in certain professions where those exist even today. And then another interesting stat, over half of employers in the survey agree that the US is losing out on top talent because of its immigration system. Obviously, that aligns pretty closely with the survey findings from Envoy's Immigration Trend Survey,
mhm,
where the majority of employers that we surveyed mentioned that immigration barriers in the US were causing them to look and consider options overseas to
mhm.
hire or relocate foreign talent. Um, and on top of that, actually moving and relocating foreign talent to Canada or Germany or the UK or Mexico because those folks, those employees of theirs, are having issues securing a visa, either short term or long term, in the US. Um, Last stat from that report that I found interesting. Here are the top improvements that were suggested by this panel of respondents in the SHRM survey to improve the immigration system in the U.S. for the workplace. Number one was enabling electronic filing throughout the immigration system. So for all visa types, obviously there's some electronic filing components to things like the H-1B cap. Also to introduce automatic renewals on a continuous basis for certain employment-based visas, having different government agencies that are involved in immigration providing more guidance than they currently do, and then also creating a known employer program, what's called a
Mm,
known employer program, which essentially is a list that the government can keep of U.S. employers that submit multiple applications
mhm.
for employment-based visa petitions for their workers, so that there's kind of less repetitive work for those employers.
Interesting, interesting. And where yeah, no, those hearing those results, those are definitely in line. So, yeah, I think the Envoy Global Report and now the SHRM report really echo some of those larger sentiments. And I think tying it to last week, we highlighted a couple of articles showing the economic benefits of immigration and how in recent years, just seeing the uptick in immigration could help explain why, inflation and the U.S. economy as a whole is not the worst case scenario that maybe we as a society as a country were potentially expecting. At this point last year. Finn, where can people find or where can listeners find this SHRM report?
Yeah, if they just go to the SHRM's website, they should be able to find it. We'll post a link in the show notes here, but it's just SHRM's 2023 Workplace Immigration Report.
Awesome, awesome. That's a good. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, for sure. It does align kind of closely with another topic we chatted about last week, which is what the government is and isn't doing when it comes to immigration policy. Eric, you were tracking a few updates in Congress. Is that correct?
Yes, 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 yes. So we did see some immigration legislation news last week. House Republicans they released a 137-page proposed bill that would introduce a lot of changes to the immigration system. Some notable the publication roll call dove into the report, and the proposed legislation would tighten asylum eligibility, expand migrant family detention, and crack down on the employment of undocumented workers. Uh, Roll call described this bill, a chunk of it as like going back to Trump era. Um, uh, Regulations as part of asylum and cracking down on that aspect. Um, but roll call also did note that this legislation does face hurdles. Obviously, Republicans in the House have a very slim majority. I think it's only 4 to 5 seats. But also, the Republican caucus is having some disagreements. So, roll call dives into it on what those disagreements are from the various sides of on the Republican caucus. And so that came out last week. And then similarly, but on the Senate side, high-ranking Senate Democrat Bob Menendez from New Jersey, he is urging the Biden administration to take executive action on immigration. According to the New York Times, he's recognizing just the reality of this current Congress, and just the lack of any noticeable immigration updates, improvements, however you want to classify them. So we have a high ranking senator urging Biden to take some action. Um, and a lot of this is coming before, this time, end of April, which is before the May 11th expiration of officially the expiration of the pandemic. And tying that into immigration, that is when Title 42 will expire. And so it seems the government is seeking to be proactive ahead of May 11th. Obviously, we'll see what happens between now and then whatever else comes up, whether it's executive action or if this House Republican bill gains traction in the House. If it does gain traction in the House, though, Finn, I think just realistically, it'll probably not go anywhere in the Senate. Although we won't know that for sure. I think just looking at the current makeup of Congress, that would be a good hunch to have.
Yeah, I mean, policymakers and lawmakers certainly have their hands full on a variety of issues in the next few months, but immigration's a really important one, and you just got to hope that while the chances of much getting done on the immigration front are slim, just based off of what's happened historically, you got to hope that policymakers remember that these actions or lack thereof impact real people in their lives and
Yes.
their families and companies, all of which these lawmakers represent. So you hope that they
Yeah.
take that into account.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, definitely. And I think just quickly tying that in, there was another article from Politico a new survey from surveying voters in seven battleground states for this upcoming 2024 election. 58% of voters disapprove of how the president is handling immigration. And then 82% of voters in this poll say the immigration system is broken. And I think anytime you get that high of a number saying something is broken, I think that speaks volume. And interestingly, the voters they said that they want to see enhanced border security and policies. Or sorry, they want to see enhanced border security, but they also want to see policies that provide a pathway to citizenship, particularly for those on DACA. Um, so I thought that was an interesting poll that also came out in recent days. That again, if it tying into what you just said is, politicians have their disagreements, but ultimately they're representing, their constituencies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the human aspect is something that our guest for today is really attuned at speaking to, given her 100,000 plus visa interviews that
Yes.
she's done, which again is just it's a mind blowing number.
Yes.
The fact that she spoke with 100,000 or more individuals who had all of their own unique backgrounds and experiences, and within a couple of minutes of an interview at a U.S. consulate, she determined whether or not they were able to come to the U.S. and start, maybe it was just a short visit or short travel for business, or maybe it was the start of their American dream and
Yeah.
moving here to be here for the rest of their lives. So super excited to share that conversation with Mandy and everything we talk about in there.
Definitely super excited for everyone to hear that. And yeah, she has a very good story of how she was able to keep track of the 100,000 interviews. So can't wait for everyone to hear that. And so with that, our conversation with Mandy Feuerbacher is coming up right now. And now I'd like to welcome Mandy Feuerbacher to Immigration and Mobility Decoded. Mandy, thank you so much for joining the show. How are things going?
Things are going great. Thanks so much for having me, Eric and Finn. I've been very excited about the show.
As have we. It's been in the works for a while, so we're so excited to have you on, and looking forward to the conversation today. But Mandy, before we hop into it, can you just talk a little bit more about your background and how you got started in immigration law?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm one of those people that I guess did things in reverse. So I was an attorney first. I was in civil litigation. Then I joined the State Department and became a consular officer, otherwise known as a visa officer, and did that for about 7 years. That isn't an unusually long time for someone to have interviewed so many visa applicants. So I interviewed about 100,000 visa applicants in my time as a consular officer. And then when I decided to retire from the State Department in 2018, I started my own immigration practice because, it's just the consular piece of the immigration puzzle. It's so integral to the entire process. And having seen so many visa applications and seen all of the immigration attorney correspondence, I was like, oh my gosh, like this is like my calling. So started my own practice, and then took a break from that and ran a startup for a while called Argo Visa, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And finally came back to private practice at the beginning of this year. And, it's been a wild ride.
For sure. 100,000 interviews. How did you manage to keep track of that number?
Yeah. So when you're a visa officer, your number actually becomes kind of like part of your identity. So I remember when I left the US Embassy in Beijing, China, that was my first tour with the State Department. I think I had like one of those can openers. Oh, sorry. No. Yeah. Beer can openers, beer bottle openers. I'm not
Yeah.
saying it right. But it actually had like a number. It's like 33,000 something, and every officer who left post that year would go away with this bottle opener that actually had the number of visas that they made decisions on. So that number is very, very important to a consular officer. And so after your first, second, and third tours, you add all of that together. That is a lot of time spent interviewing visa applicants.
Totally. We're gonna hop and we're gonna talk a little bit more about your time as a counselor officer in just a quick second. But we always like to start and also ask our guests, what are some of your favorite things to do outside of work?
No, it's so important to talk
Yeah.
about, not only work, right?
Right.
Um, I am a big snowboarder, and so, winters are really great. I always look forward to getting on the slopes. And last week I was in Lake Tahoe skiing with my kids, and it's just such a feeling of exhilaration, like going down that mountainside. And we have had amazing snow in Northern California this year. So I've had a very happy winter.
I'll be honest, I'm quite jealous. I'm based on the East Coast and we had almost no snow this winter. So I made the wrong decision to move away from California this past year. Um,
We stole it all.
yeah, I know. It all dropped down to the Sierras and the Rockies, and there was nothing left for the Appalachians. So that's usually how it goes. You mentioned your tour in Beijing at the U.S. Embassy there. Now, it's no secret that the embassy in Beijing is one of the busiest U.S. embassies, U.S. consulates in the world. What was your experience like working there? What did your day to day look like as a U.S. visa officer?
Oh my gosh. I'm so glad you mentioned that because it was always packed in the consular section there. I remember, especially during the summers when all of your international students would come in, it was student visa season. I think we would regularly have about 4,400 people go through the waiting room every single day. And every single person had to be fingerprinted and interviewed by a consular officer before they could leave. And so even though they plan the schedule out, sometimes, interviews take a little bit longer than you expect. And I remember there were definitely evenings that you would be interviewing until 6 or even 7 p.m. because you had to help everybody who arrived before you could go home. And so as you can imagine, for consular officers, efficiency is, almost like one of the top tenets, just making sure that you are as quick as possible in making those decisions. And it was really a hard job, one of the hardest jobs I've ever done.
Yeah, you mentioned efficiency, and sometimes I think in the public view that's a knock on the experience of going through a visa interview overseas. Is that a consular officer may only ask you a handful of questions before they approve, or in some unfortunate cases deny your visa application. Can you explain the why behind the questions that you would ask as a consular officer and what you were looking for in those interviews?
Yeah, I think every consular officer is trying to whittle down the interview to, as short of a timeline as possible to very quickly determine a foreign national's purpose of travel, what exactly they're doing. And so the consular officer knows the law. They're there to uphold the law. I think one of the main things that they're trying to get at for non-immigrant visas, so for temporary visas like an H-1B or an L-1 or an O-1, is to quickly determine whether or not that person has what we call immigrant intent. And so if you get the sense that, the person in front of you actually has the intention of staying long term in the United States, possibly a illegal overstay, anything like that, then that is when you have to basically put your foot down and deny the visa.
Of the most common visa types, you mentioned F1s for students, B for pleasure, business travel are very common as well. The H-1B is a visa, we in our audience know very well. Which are the hardest to determine that intent in the interviews that you experienced?
I think probably for the B1, B2 visa because, it encompasses both business and tourism. And that just includes so many different types of reasons why people want to go to the United States. When you're interviewing someone for like an H-1B visa, for example, you know that they're a highly skilled worker. The questions tend to be the same. But when somebody is going for business, they could be, going for business meetings, or all of a sudden they're going for vacation to visit friend or family member. It could just be so many different types of scenarios that you kind of sometimes it's a little harder to get your mind around it and evaluate a person under those circumstances.
I'm going to mention what might be one of the top three scariest words in immigration law: administrative processing. What is
Mhm.
it, Mandy? Why is it so scary, and why can it take so long sometimes?
Yeah. So administrative processing is the State Department's lingo for basically any reason why a consular officer doesn't want to make a decision right in that moment. So there's actually two different types of administrative processing. It could be mandatory administrative processing, some sort of security processing, or it could be non-mandatory, meaning that the consular officer simply just wants to take a little bit more time with the case. Usually, administrative processing happens because a visa applicant or foreign national is not prepared for their visa interview. They're not giving the answers that the officer wants to hear. They're not being thorough. They're not being proactive. And ultimately, that makes the job of the visa officer really hard to make a decision. And at the end of the day, if they can't get that information out of them, they might say, you know what? I think I'm going to have to take some time and really review this case. So what happens is after a shift, a consular officer will take probably a stack of like 20 cases back to their desk. All of those cases have been placed in administrative processing, and there's many different types of administrative processing. And then they're going to review them and decide, okay, can I approve this case or should I deny it? I always recommend clients avoid administrative processing at all times because it's almost like it's halfway to a visa denial. Sometimes consular officers really hate giving bad news to people. And if they, take the case back to their desk and ultimately decide, you know what, I don't think this person qualifies. If they deny the case at that point, then they don't have to tell somebody to their face, who's very disappointed, hey, you unfortunately are not eligible. So that happens as well.
It's been a bit. I think you mentioned your career at the State Department ended in 2018. I was an immigration paralegal at the time, and we would have clients where they'd be stuck in administrative processing for 200 or 300 days sometimes. What was the
Mm-hmm.
cause of that really extended administrative processing during under
Mm-hmm.
the Trump administration, and has that been fixed under the Biden administration to any degree?
I think some of it has been fixed. I know that the department has put a lot of emphasis on trying to get visa wait times down from getting visa appointments to also the actual processing of those cases. Some things are really hard to avoid, and some of the things that people don't understand about the behind the scenes aspect of visa processing is that consular officers are constantly on the move. They move around all the time. Not only are they rotating between different units of the consular section, sometimes you'll do 6 months interviewing non-immigrant visa applicants, then you'll move into the immigrant visa unit for 6 months, then you rotate into the fraud prevention unit and sometimes into ACS where you're dealing with US passports and American prisoners. And some officers will even rotate to other sections of the embassy or consulate. So what happens is when a case gets stuck in administrative processing, and sometimes they're waiting for a response back from DC, or they're waiting for some other agency to respond, that officer may not be around by the time a response comes back. And it'll be a different officer who then has to look at this case that they've never interviewed, and they don't even know the background of the case, and they're trying to piece together based on the notes of the previous officer what happened in their case. And then they realize, you know what, this question of the previous officer was answered, but I have some additional questions. I'm going to have to call this person back in for another interview, or I'm going to have to go back, reach back out to the agency in DC, or reach back out to the main State Department for my question. And then it sets off the entire process all over again. And so then by the time that answer comes back, again, I'm describing probably the worst case scenario, but you could have several officers on the same case just because of how long it takes and how frequently consular officers are moved out of their roles in the section, that it's almost best to try to anticipate what the officer is going to need, give them everything at the moment that they're ready to make a decision, and put your best foot forward instead of, gosh, they could have made that decision except for this one document. They're going to have to ask the visa applicant to resubmit it. Then they're not here when it comes in. I mean, it just can be a huge nightmare with too many, pairs of hands touching things. So you really just want to take every moment that you have.
Definitely. Mandy, you just mentioned the long visa wait times. I'm curious, what are some of the factors that are going into these long visa wait times?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes from, under the Trump administration and during the pandemic, a lot of foreign service officers left the department. There was this sort of, uh, uh, I want to say outflux. I don't even think that's a real word, but I feel like people have like left. And the State Department has been trying really hard to hire more people to fill that role of, entry level consular officers who are really needed to be on the visa line. So that has really affected the long visa wait times. One other factor is the pandemic itself. As you know, consular processing essentially shut down for much of the pandemic. If you go into these consular sections around the world, it's tons of people crammed in together in small spaces. That has always been how consular sections have been. And so when all of a sudden there's this rollout of this policy where, hey, you have to socially distance, there has to be 6 feet in between each visa applicant. I mean, that really lessens the ability of the consular officers to do their job. Not to mention, consular officers were told by the State Department at the time, hey, if you don't feel like you're safe working in this foreign country, you can actually come back and work in the main State Department. So there are people with families who decided to leave at that time. And so just like this whole chain reaction of events happening around the world that has made it more difficult for the State Department to get back on track. But I think things are getting a lot better. I think that the State Department has increased the processing of visas up 60% from last year, if I recall correctly from the numbers. And so things are getting back on track, and they're doing tons and tons of hiring. And so there should be, new consular officers. I think Mission India said that they hope to be back to pre-pandemic staffing levels by this summer. So there's definitely a ton of effort by the State Department to get those wait times down.
Mm-hmm. What tips do you have for individuals who are navigating these long visa wait times?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that they can do. First of all, they can request a visa expedite. And to do that, you first have to have a visa appointment. So what I always tell clients is go in and book your visa appointment, even if, it's a year out from when you need the visa, because you need that appointment and then you can request the specific embassy or consulate for an expedite. Then you want to go to the website of the embassy or consulate and make sure you qualify for one of the expedite reasons. Sometimes it's for a medical emergency. Sometimes emergency business travel is permitted. It's really on a post by post basis, and see if you can get an expedited visa appointment that day. I remember when I was a visa officer at the US consulate in Hong Kong, I used to be in charge of reviewing all of the expedite appointments. And you can see when a reason is compelling versus not. And so you really want to put a little bit of time and effort in making sure it's a good reason for requesting the expedite. The other thing that a lot of people don't know is that if you request an expedited visa appointment and then you go and interview and you end up getting denied that visa, it's very unlikely that you'll qualify for an expedite again. So it makes it even a more high stakes process that you want to make sure that you get the visa appointment, but that you also pass. A second option, if your expedited visa appointment is denied, is to consider applying in another country. So you can actually apply in any country in the world for a US visa, but keep in mind that and those appointments are called third country national appointments because you're really applying as a third country national. There are certain things you should be aware of. It might be more difficult to get a visa approved applying in a foreign country. And so there is a little bit of strategy involved there. And if you're someone considering applying somewhere else, I would say always apply at a big embassy or consulate versus a very, very small one, because at those bigger places, that's when the consular officer frequently see different types of passports from all over the world. They're going to feel more comfortable and confident in making that decision versus if you go to a small one person consular section and they're like, I've never seen this type of passport before. I'm just going to have to deny your visa. I just remember during the pandemic, gosh, it was such an interesting situation where a lot of Chinese citizens were unable to fly back to China because of the quarantine restrictions. And so, for some reason, one of the easy places that they could get to was Ecuador. And so, a lot of Chinese clients were going to Ecuador, applying in, Quito, and getting denied. And they were like, I have no idea why I'm getting denied. And I can only imagine, because I just know the consular world so well, that, you have this like smaller embassy, and they're just like, I've never seen a Chinese passport before. What am I supposed to do with this? So they would deny those visas and say, you know what, you have to go back to your home country to apply. Which then, of course, like the Chinese citizen is like, but I can't get to my home country. That's the reason why I'm applying here. And so if that person had gone to, a bigger post like Embassy London, or the consulate in Frankfurt, it would just be easier for them to get their visa approved, in my opinion.
That's super interesting to hear. What if, though, let's say there's a hypothetical scenario where you're working with a client and they're like, but I can't get to that bigger embassy or consulate. What might that
Mm-hmm.
what steps might that individual then take?
Yeah, so I would say if they can't get to and it doesn't have to be like, not everybody has to go to London. And if State Department people are listening to this podcast, they're just like, no, don't tell everybody to go to London. We can't
It's a great
handle,
city, though.
you
Great
know,
city. Awesome food there.
great city. Exactly. But like, maybe they can go to the embassy in Paris. It doesn't
Mm.
have to be like one specific large place. I'm just saying that when you're looking at a big embassy versus a smaller consulate, if you're applying outside of your home country, always a better idea to go to the bigger location.
Definitely. Got it.
What are the other, sorry to jump in, Eric, what are the other risks for processing or attempting visa processing as a third country national?
Yeah, I think what you're looking at is just an officer who is not familiar with the culture of that visa applicant's passport. Like, I'll give you an example. When you're an officer working in China, you get really familiar with the Chinese visa applicant situations. What is considered a good applicant? When is it easy to just approve someone? What are some of the common fraud trends? Whereas an officer in Ecuador is not going to know anything about that. And so if the scenario is really new to them, it's going to make them feel really nervous about attaching their name to an approved visa application. So every person who gets their visa approved, the officer's name actually gets attributed to that case, which is why a lot of times, if it's a really complicated case, or high profile case that's all over the news, these officers get really nervous, and they're like, well, I don't want to be that person that that approves this case, where most consular officers would not approve it. And so really everything relates back to this culture of consular officers on how to make them feel confident about a visa application. How can they feel, okay, I have a good grasp of what's happening here. This person definitely, deserves a visa, is eligible for a visa. So let's go ahead and approve them. And that takes a little bit of time too, because every case, you can never know exactly what officer is going to get a case, but whether that officer is really experienced and has been, on the line for a while, managing cases, that will be easier than, an officer who has just arrived in country and has only been doing the job for a couple of weeks, and they're just thrown on the line and told, like, okay, now you got to make 150 decisions a day that's really going to impact these people's travel plans and futures and goals. So I think this is a really interesting trend right now, because the State Department is hiring so many new officers, that I think for the next couple of years, we can expect newer consular officers that are not as familiar with going really fast or being really efficient. And so I would say that for foreign nationals, you should be even more prepared for the visa interview, because oftentimes you're going to have to point the officers in the right direction and helping them make a decision in your favor.
Mandy, what are your thoughts on the plans to launch a pilot program later in 2023 that would allow some temporary visa holders, such as H-1B visa holders, to renew their visas from the U.S. rather than having to travel back to their home countries, to renew at U.S. consulates abroad.
I think that would be such a great move. And I've always heard about how this program used to be offered, and then for
Right.
some reason it was stopped. And I think seeing all of the issues that I have with H-1B visa holders, especially during the pandemic, not being able to go back to their home countries. And then when they finally do, getting stuck outside of, the US for months at a time with their jobs waiting for them has just been so traumatic for people. So I think this is going to be awesome and very welcome and super helpful to foreign nationals who are like, I don't want to go all the way back across the world and risk being stuck, and being able to manage that process from the US will be great.
Is there anything else, like if you were immigration czar, or if you were able to make a couple of impactful changes, how else would you improve visa wait times?
Yeah, this is something that you and I were talking about earlier, and I know you guys interviewed Chris Richardson, a few weeks ago, but the idea of remote visa interviews have always, kind of been going around, and I think that would be really great. I think that is something that could really speed up the efficiency for the State Department. When you have to have so many people physically travel to the embassy, and one of the other big problems that the State Department has is with the demand of visas rising, they have had to constantly do larger and larger build outs for embassies to create more, waiting room space, more windows. But if remote visa interviews can happen, then the need would go away, and that would save the government millions of dollars. So that could be one way that would really speed up the efficiency of visa processing. But this is how it's been done for so long, and I don't know if there really is any movement in that direction, but I hope there will be.
Mandy, one question I wanted to ask you is that there's currently a discrepancy between wait times for visas and for visa appointments, depending on where the consulate is overseas. And you mentioned that smaller consulates tend to have fewer staff, right? So it would make sense that they have more of a backlog. But is there any other reason for the discrepancies? Is there do certain secretaries of state and consular heads put an emphasis on fixing the problems in India or China or the Philippines or Mexico, where where the biggest masses of immigration work is, versus in Buenos Aires in Argentina or in Cape Town or in a country like Ghana, or maybe just a country with fewer immigrants coming from those places on a regular basis, or frankly, fewer voices in the U.S. Complaining
Mm.
about the wait times in those smaller countries at those smaller consulates.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on. I mean, what do they call it? Like the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So for places where there's a lot more visibility and it's always in the news that, gosh, people not getting visas is really impacting the US economy, then the ambassador to that country and the minister, counselor for consular affairs, everybody is going to be very aware of the issue and putting a lot of pressure on the consular section, providing the resources that they need to get those wait times down. Especially for bigger missions like Mission India, Mission China. I just remember if they're really, really behind, sometimes the State Department or that mission will make a big call out for consular officers to do temporary duties of assignments to those countries. So, for example, when I was working in Mexico, that was my second tour after China. There was a time where my consulate was just really not that busy with visa work, but China was kind of on fire. They were getting really long wait times. And so they were calling all consular officers from around the world who wouldn't mind flying to China, living there for about a month or two, just, helping keep the backlog down. So I actually went to the US consulate in Guangzhou for a month, and I had a great time, going to a different country. I think I just lived in a hotel for a month trying to get the backlog down. But those are some of the tools the State Department has at its disposal to try to get more bodies, more resources to help the places that are highly visible. The other thing that people don't realize is that for smaller countries and smaller posts, you have fewer officers, but another issue is that if that officer gets sick, let's say they get COVID and they're out for 6 weeks, there's not, a number of other officers who can step into their shoes. Whereas when you're at Embassy Beijing, you're maybe one of 50 officers and other officers can just take over your work. And so this happens a lot if somebody goes on maternity leave, but they're not able to get somebody to backfill that position quickly, or it's summer transfer season and all of a sudden, they realize this family that was supposed to show up and take over the chief of immigrant visas, all of a sudden they can't show up because their kids got really sick, or for any number of reasons that can really cause a big problem in terms of continuity and making sure that they're staying on top of their numbers. So those are some of the things that people don't really see all the time, but we all know is just a part of life in the State Department.
Yeah, I think those mechanisms that you kind of pull back the curtain on for the audience here are really interesting. That it is great to hear, and I'm sure it will be for a lot of folks in the audience, that the State Department is proactively trying to address some of those gaps. I wanted to take a step back, though. You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that you recently started your own practice. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, how that's going, what sort of clients you're working with, and anything else?
Yeah, so my practice is really focused on consular processing. It's this niche of immigration law, and I think people with my expertise were sort of really sorely needed in this space, because the problem with immigration practitioners is, even though they know everything about USCIS, they've done all the petition filings, they know every crazy RFE that has come down the pipeline, they know exactly how to handle that. When it comes to the State Department and visa stamping, where foreign nationals are not allowed to bring attorneys into the interview, they're kind of at a loss. All they know is secondhand stories from their clients of what happened at the interview. And then there's also very limited options once this person is outside of the country and there's no appeals process for the visa stamp interview. And so really my practice is focused on helping people get unstuck from sticky administrative processing, situations, or perhaps they've had a visa denial and they want to go in and apply again. So any sorts of visa problems that could come up, I'm sort of like a visa problem solver, you could say. And it's been really great because I've been able to team up with a lot of different immigration attorneys who just have a consular issue that they're not sure how to handle. And what I have seen just in the last 2 months of practicing is that, there's a lot of high net worth individuals out there who just don't have time for, complicated visa situations. They needed to be in the US yesterday, signing a massive $50 million deal, and they need an expert who can help get their case moving again. And that's really the type of work that I do. And I have to say, I really enjoy it. I enjoy working with clients one-on-one, helping shed light on what's going on behind the scenes, helping them understand this process that, if I hadn't been a visa officer for 7 years, there's no way that I could be able to do the type of work that I do now. And so in some ways, I feel like attorneys are amazing for trying to tackle this entire world that they don't really understand, because there is just such a strong cultural element to it for how this government agency looks at cases, how consular officers are trained, who they are. Most of them are not attorneys, how they like to receive information. And it's almost like there are invisible rules that they don't tell immigration practitioners. They don't tell, global mobility teams at companies. They don't tell foreign nationals, hey, these are the rules that you have to follow. And yet you are expected to follow them. And so I'm sort of this person that just kind of sheds light on that. And I'm also a big immigration nerd, so I could talk about these cases like all day long, and I really enjoy it. And I woke up this morning and had this great email from a client that I've been working with. And the email was just like, my visa was approved. Thank you so much. And it was a complicated case, and it was still a fight even to the very end, where she had been denied a visa before. She worked with me. I sent her back in, and she was put in administrative processing because even though they weren't going to deny her visa a second time with my help, they still weren't sure they wanted to approve it. And then I had to give her some additional tips. And finally, the visa was approved. But to get those emails just really makes me feel like I'm making such a big difference. And I just really love my work.
So one might say you're the Olivia Pope of visa appointments for anyone who understands the scandal reference.
They might say that. They might say that. And I think, I also feel really lucky that enough people have heard about me that people are actually being a lot more proactive about the visa process, which is always the best way to solve a problem. So instead of, me getting someone who has been denied 8 or 9 times, now you're getting a lot of foreign nationals who are very aware of how high stakes this process is. And they're like, gosh, like a lot of things have changed since my last visa stamp interview. And I just want to make sure that I'm doing everything right. And those are my favorite types of clients because what's the saying? It's like an ounce of medicine is worth like something, I can't remember, like an ounce of cure or something. But like, yeah, if you could just in advance figure out if you're going to have a problem, work with an expert, go in absolutely prepared, then you're going to do so much better versus being denied and then being like, okay, what do I do now?
I imagine those emails with the subject line of "my visa was approved" are probably some of the most joyful moments and exciting emails to get.
Yeah, I've also had clients who, will get on a Zoom meeting and they're like, it's just still in pending status. I don't know what to do. And I'm like, okay, log in right now. Let's just make sure that, nothing has changed. And they log in and they're just like, my visa's approved. And like, I have literally had people burst into tears over Zoom with me. And like, for me to be a part of their journey has made me feel like, gosh, like I'm really making a difference. And yeah, I love those moments.
Yeah,
It's why I do what I do.
totally. Mandy, you obviously mentioned you started your own firm. I guess what any entrepreneurial tips, maybe for anyone who's listening, who whether it's an immigration firm or frankly any job. I guess what have you learned on this journey of yours?
Yeah, I think that, don't underestimate yourself and don't undervalue your expertise. Before I made this jump, of course, I was very nervous, as someone who's always been an employee and, was a government bureaucrat for a really long time. It's just really scary to think about not having that safety net. But once I did it, I was like, oh my gosh, like this is what I was meant to do. What have I been doing all of those years? And so I guess, just sometimes it's really scary and it should be because you're doing something new, but just trust yourself to know that you'll find a way to make it work. And failure is a part of life. I think I heard somebody say that if you haven't failed, then you haven't tried enough. And so knowing that it's okay to fail and then sometimes you might even succeed beyond your wildest dreams, I think that's always something that we should all aim for.
Those are excellent words of wisdom, Mandy. As we approach our wrap up, where can our listeners find you on social or website? We know you have a your YouTube channel, a pretty sizable YouTube channel. What's the handle of that, and where else can people find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on YouTube at my channel is called ZF Visa. And so that's just my name and visa. And you can also find me on my website at www.zfvisa.com. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I'm always posting things about visas and immigration. So feel free to follow me and connect with me there. And I try to film new YouTube videos, but I've just been inundated with with work, which is great. I think that's what everybody wants. But I love making YouTube videos about the nuances of consular processing and visa interview problems. So happy to see you there as well. And I try to personally respond to all of the comments and questions that I get there.
Love it, love it. Well, Mandy, final question. Anything else or anything coming up in your neck of the woods that you want to highlight or plug?
Yeah, so I'm attending a couple of conferences in the next few months. So, for the folks listening to your podcast, if they're involved in AILA at all, I'm going to Tokyo in May, and I'll be speaking on consular processing. And I'm also speaking to a lot of US universities at the NAFSA conference in DC at the end of May, and finally going to AILA National as well. And doing a 7 a.m. panel, which I'm sure probably nobody is going to show up for, but it's going to be really exciting. So if those are any of the events that you guys are all coming to, feel free to connect with me. I'd love to meet up.
Awesome. Sounds great. Well, Mandy, we appreciate your time. This was a lovely conversation. And thank you so much for hopping on the show today.
Thanks so much, Eric and Ben. It's been great speaking to both of you.
Thanks. All right.
Thanks, Mandy. Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to Immigration and Mobility Decoded. If you watched this video on YouTube and you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to the Envoy Global YouTube channel for more content like this. Otherwise, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, everyone.